Do you need help with the words? Or do you recognize the opening bars of perhaps the most recognizable melody in the entire Jewish world? Tradition, tradition. The opening song from Fiddler on the Roof, the greatest and perhaps most unlikely success story in the history of American theater. Opening in 1964, the original production of Fiddler on the Roof ran for 3,000 performances, making it by far the longest-running Broadway show of its day. Since then, there's been a major movie adaptation. You probably saw that too, yeah? 4 revivals on Broadway, multiple touring companies, untold university, high school, and community theater productions. More than 1 billion people have seen Fiddler on the Roof, on stage or in film, in multiple languages, and all around the world. And right now, a 5th revival of Fiddler is playing to sellout crowds off Broadway at the Little Schubert Theater on 42nd Street in New York in Yiddish, which, believe it or not, is a first. And having seen it performed this summer, I can tell you it is quite literally a revelation. By the way, everybody thought this was a terrible idea. The show is way too Jewish on its own. No one's going to understand it, nobody's going to come to it, and there aren't enough Jews in New York to keep a Yiddish Fiddler on the Roof in business for more than a few months, and that's if we give the tickets away. That was actually printed in a column about it. But they said that about the original production in English, too, and they were wrong about that as well. It's a wonderful show. A great company of actors, directed by Broadway and film legend Joel Grey. And in case you're wondering, they project English subtitles in flowing red laser script on the side of the stage. But the revelation of the evening was that nobody really bothered looking at the subtitles. Think about it. Do you really need subtitles for Wenn ich bin a Rothschild, ja ba 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 bum? Actually, that was the one where everyone looked at the subtitles because we all heard the word Rothschild instead of rich man, and we thought the translator was playing games with us. Turns out, If I Were a Rothschild was actually the title of another short story by Sholem Aleichem, the author of Tevye the Milkman Tales, which inspired the play, and the translator took a few liberties with writing the Yiddish text. Like the word tradition, which was sometimes translated as Torah, which was an interesting take on the meaning of the text. But the point is, we know the songs, most of the dialogue, all of the jokes, so we don't really need subtitles to understand the show or its values. People were singing along, using the original English lyrics, and the really amazing part about this Yiddish production of a schmaltzy 60s musical based on the stories of Sholem Aleichem, who died 100 years ago, is that about half the audience were young people, which is pretty rare in the theater for any show these days. Many of them were there with their grandparents, laughing at the Yiddish jokes way before the super titles would appear, laughing and singing, reveling in the moment together. Some of us had seen the Broadway show way back when. Some of us had seen the movie. A lot of the audience was probably in the show themselves, in community theater productions, or school, or at summer camp. Steven Skyble, the actor who plays Tevye in the production, he doesn't speak Yiddish either. Most of the actors didn't speak Yiddish. Joel Grey, the director of the show, kind of speaks Yiddish. He says he speaks Mickey Katz, which means he only remembers the Yiddish that his father spoke, and that was, let us say, a mishmash of other languages, some of the words made up entirely. Joel thought it was Yiddish when he was a child, but whenever he tried to speak it to anyone else besides his father, they thought he was doing a stand-up comedy routine. So who is the Yiddish for? For Sholem Aleichem? As an honor to the beloved author marking the 100th anniversary of his death? For the entire lost world of Yiddish culture and Eastern European Jewish life, lost to the Holocaust, and now existing only in memories, in the pages of books, and in black and white photos of the age? Or is the Yiddish dialogue there for us, despite the fact that we don't really understand the words, as a remembrance, a poignant reminder of who we are and where we came from, not so many generations ago? Does the show really need words in any language at this point, when the message we see so universally on the stage? It's Fiddler on the Roof. We don't really need subtitles to understand the show or its values. And amidst this sea of nostalgia and remembrance, the whole experience brought me back to the Fiddler of my childhood, which taught me a lesson that seems particularly appropriate for us on this Yom Kippur day. Sometime in my high school years, the Marquette Community Theater decided to put on Fiddler on the Roof for their big production that year. The director of the community theater was a former student of my dad's, and he came to talk to him about the show. Dad assumed he was asking advice, so he gave it to him. Dad told him that there weren't enough Jews in Marquette County to fill out the cast of Fiddler on the Roof, much less an audience. It was a sweet idea, but nobody would come. Nevertheless, the director was convinced it was going to be a success. The show was closing on Broadway to rave reviews. The rights had just come available for community theaters, and he wasn't really asking Dad for advice. He came to ask Dad to play Tevye. My father, as some of you know, was a professor of Shakespeare, theater history, and the director of theater at Northern Michigan University. But in his youth, he was an actor. He had toured in productions of Guys and Dolls, and ironically, he actually performed in summer stock with Joel Grey, who's currently directing the Yiddish Fiddler on the Roof. It had been about 20 years since he had acted on stage. He was flattered, but not really interested. He said he'd think about it, and then he came home and let us know. My sisters only wanted to know which of Tevye's daughters they got to play. My mother pushed hard, promising to run lines with him because, having acted together in their college days, she knew how much he hated learning a part. Eventually, he agreed, and my father and two sisters were cast in the show. Mom dutifully ran lines with all of them, which is a good thing because the woman who'd been cast as Golda fell ill. Since Mom knew all the lines from practicing them with Dad, she ended up taking over that role as well. So somehow, one miraculous night, in the barren tundra of northern Michigan, I sat in the middle of a packed auditorium watching my family in what had to be the most unlikely performance of Fiddler on the Roof you could possibly imagine. No one else but my family was Jewish on stage, though Dad had carefully coached them with their accents and their lines. Practically no one in the audience was Jewish either because all the Jews were on stage. I sat with my wrestling coach, Peter Karampoulos, who was kind of second father to me in those days, and Peter had invited his parents to come along. His father was the Greek Orthodox priest in town, and his mother didn't speak a word of English. Mrs. Karampoulos seemed to be following the show pretty well. She loved all the dancing and singing, which reminded her, I suppose, of the joyous Greek festivals they held at their church. And she seemed to be following the storyline pretty well, with the actors' gestures, until they came to the part where Tevye banishes his daughter Chava for marrying Fedka. She leans over to Peter and she asks him in Greek, "Why doesn't he approve? He seems like such a nice boy." Not knowing how to explain the entire plot line of this essentially Jewish play in one sentence, Peter said back to her in Greek, "Mom, he's not Orthodox." Oh, now she understood. Well, apparently she thought Fiddler on the Roof was a play about poor downtrodden Greek peasants struggling to preserve their Orthodox faith until they were driven from their home towards the vision of an America where someday they would all find freedom. But you know what? She got the important parts. It's Fiddler on the Roof. You don't really need the subtitles to understand the show or its values. Shalom Aleichem, the most beloved Yiddish storyteller of all time, wrote the Tevye the Milkman tales in Yiddish as an essential Jewish tale that spoke to the generation of Jews lost in translation from Anatevka to America, trying to hold on to who they are and as they struggle to become who they want to be. Shalom Aleichem himself witnessed the pogroms recounted in the Fiddler on the Roof. Traveling to America in October of 1906 aboard the SS St. Louis, with little more in his pocket or idea for the future in America than Tevye had. It's not an easy balance, like a Fiddler on the Roof, remembering who you are, holding on to your values, the traditions, what you know to be right. Joseph Stein and Sheldon Harnick translated Shalom Aleichem stories and set them to music on the Broadway stage, where, much to everyone's surprise, this essentially Jewish show touched such a universal chord with audiences of every faith from all kinds of backgrounds who shared these values and shared the experience of making their way to these shores. And now, a century after Shalom Aleichen's passing, a new production of these same Tevye tales, translating the stories and the songs from the English back into the Yiddish, is playing to yet another generation of audiences, none of whom understand Yiddish, but it's Fiddler on the Roof. We don't really need the subtitles to understand the show or its values. We are all immigrants, refugees traveling through time, driven at one time or another to find a home in a foreign land. We hold on to our traditions as best we can, and most important of these values is that we are all, at some deep down level, the same. That supporting one another as we try to balance our way is an essential part of who we are and what we do. In the last moments of the play, they say this strongly, without words, but in the clearest of ways. Tevye, downtrodden, chased from his home, leaving Anatevka, picks up his cart and sets out towards an uncertain future, leaving Anatevka behind with little more than the clothes on his back, his family, and the few things he can carry with him along the way. And then the fiddler appears with nowhere to go and no one to travel with. And Tevye simply motions to him to bring him along. Tevye takes the fiddler along with him, even though he's facing an uncertain future. Or perhaps he takes him along intentionally because of it. Tevye is a walking contradiction. He sings about tradition, but he knows very little about it. Tevye doesn't need to know the words or the customs to sing tradition, and neither do we. Tevye knows the right thing to do, and that instinct is the surest sign of his Jewish soul, and ours as well. This isn't a political sermon. I have no letters to Congress for you to write, no marches for you to attend. This is a values sermon, a reminder of who we are and where we came from, and who, more importantly, we might aspire yet to be. Never forget your roots. Never forget who you are. Never lose sight of our future here in this land of freedom, which welcomed us when we and our families had nowhere else to go. This is our tradition. 36 times in the Torah we're commanded to welcome the stranger, more than any other tradition in the Torah. Just like the traditional Tevye welcomes Perchik, the young socialist with the crazy ideas. Just like Tevye's family is counting on the welcome of their cousins here in America. Just like my family. Just like yours. Just like all the families who make up this great melting pot of a nation, which we all claim as one. Our stories are all different, but deep down, we are all the same. All travelers, refugees across time and space, and all of us at one time or another in need of aid. Welcoming the stranger is who we are, and who at our best we were meant to be. The universal values of Fiddler on the Roof have been etched in our soul by the words of Torah, and in the words of Shalom Aleichem, whose name, appropriately enough, means welcome to all. Shalom Aleichem. May it be a good year, a year of blessing for all of us.